Tenet is full of Easter eggs and hidden meanings, and while you may think you just about understand it, like the sun, the more you look at it, the more blinding it can be, with more and more things you missed the first times coming to the forefront. Does your head hurt? That is the question posed to us halfway through the movie by Robert Pattinson's Neil, and if you're at all like me, your answer is probably yes. Christopher Nolan's time-bending espionage movie is so packed full of information, hidden meanings, crazy plot twists, and Easter eggs, it's enough to give you a full-blown migraine. In this video, we will take a look at some of the things you may have missed in the movie and some of the devices Nolan uses to really mess with your head. From hidden symbols to Easter eggs to Nolan's other work to subtle clues threaded throughout. Get ready to put your oxygen mask on as we invert ourselves back through the time-bending epic that is Tenet. And of course, if you haven't seen the movie, there are tons of spoilers within, so you may want to stop watching now or face potential annihilation. Okay, that was a little overdramatic, but it will probably spoil the movie for you. This is one that you probably caught, but with Tenet being a sensory overload from start to finish and with a ton of expository dialogue drowned out by a booming score, you would be easily forgiven for missing what the true meaning of Tenet is. We already knew that it was a palindrome, the same backwards as it is forwards, but towards the end of the movie, we realize it has more significance than that. Tenet is what happens when two 10 minutes meet, one going forward and one going backward, and it's a hint to the temporal pincer movement that happens in the final gunfight. Sator may be the name of Kenneth Branagh's Bond-style maniacal villain, but it has more significance than it may seem. In fact, his name is a direct reference to the Sator or Rhodes square, a 5-word Latin palindrome. What makes this significant is that every major plot point of the movie corresponds with this square, such as Arepo, the forger of the Goya painting, Opera, where the siege is held at the beginning of the movie, Rhodes, which is the name of the security company at the free port in Oslo, as we mentioned, the name of the primary antagonist is Sator, and of course, the most obvious one is the organization trying to prevent Doomsday and the title itself, Tenet. Just like its name, the movie is a palindrome, as we learn that not only are the events that transpire at the beginning of the movie the actual ending, but that the whole movie is a temporal pincer movement, with Robert Pattinson's Neil moving backwards in the timeline while John David Washington's the protagonist moves through the plot chronologically. This makes it like Pulp Fiction for the fact that everything ends how it began, with a chopped up timeline in the middle. Nolan has always had a fascination with time and how the filmmaker can warp time in any way they see fit, a recurring theme in his work, such as Memento, Interstellar, and Inception. After watching the movie, you will know that it was actually the protagonist who hired Neil and brought him into the Tenet mission, and it was actually his sacrifice at the end that made the whole mission possible. We find this out by seeing the piece of red string attached to his backpack, the same string that was on the backpack of the dead soldier in the missile silo. But one thing you might have missed is that piece of red string appears in an earlier scene. In the opening siege, the protagonist is saved by a masked gunman who has a red piece of string on his backpack, meaning that it was Neil who saved his life during the siege.
Whoa.
While the color red is used to identify Neil with the piece of string, red and blue are also used to identify who is inverted and who is not, with a blue marker for who is inverted and red for who is going forward. Not only are the teams divided into these colors in the temporal pincer movement, but we also see these themes beforehand. In the scene where Sator is trying to find the location of the briefcase, we see that both rooms are split in half, with the inverted side in blue and the non-inverted side in red. Not only is the lighting used to show this, but sometimes even the costume design, with a member of Rhodes wearing a red lapel during the forward timeline, as well as Kat wearing a red dress in the forward timeline. Not only do we find out at the end of the movie that the protagonist is the one who recruited Neil, but that he is the one who created the whole operation. In the one scene he goes back in time, he tries to convince Priya to stop him from accidentally placing the algorithm in Sator's hands, but Priya refuses. In hindsight, we know that this is for the best, as they are able to defeat Sator, and it was due to the temporal pincer movement. But the protagonist realizes during the epilogue that it was he who founded the whole organization of Tenet, and that he must go back in time to put in motion the chain of events. Tenet is arguably the most Nolan-y movie of all, and even features some of the director's greatest hits. Not only are there recurring themes and motifs in Tenet that we've seen in his other movies, but similar scenes to those in his library. And no, not just having the characters walk around the city while explaining the plot to the audience and everyone around them. One of the examples of the Nolan callbacks are through his action set pieces. For example, the hijacking of the plutonium in Estonia. In Tenet, we see the protagonist and Neil use a variety of vehicles, primarily large ones, in a convoy to steal plutonium from an armored truck. The sequence feels like a direct callback to the compromised convoy scene in The Dark Knight, where the Joker tries to kill Harvey Dent in the armored police truck. The convoy sequence then immediately breaks out into an Inception-style car chase. Another example of these set pieces is the protagonist's fight with his masked self at the Freeport. It feels similar to Joseph Gordon-Levitt's dream fight scene in Inception, with the use of dizzying camera work and an intense score. Also, the final raid against a horde of masked enemies at the end of Tenet also feels vaguely similar to the final showdowns in Inception and The Dark Knight Rises. When rumors started percolating around the internet that Tenet could potentially be a sequel to the movie Inception, it was a tasty prospect to say the least, and a notion that admittedly we at Screen Rant bought into. However, that turned out not to be the case. In fact, the movie turned out to be closer to Nolan's earlier masterpiece, Memento. While it was not a direct sequel, the way time is shaped and how the end fits into the beginning is strikingly similar to Memento and seems to be a theme that Nolan likes to revisit. Although, Memento admittedly has a somewhat more grisly end. While Tenet may not be a direct sequel to Inception, its spirit can be felt throughout. Both Nolan and Washington describe Tenet as related to Inception, but more of a distant cousin than a sibling. Not only is Nolan's trademark visual style, epic score, and time-bending themes scattered throughout, but we even see some of the same plot devices, a secret technology that the heroes have to uncover, character archetypes. Both Tom Hardy's Eames and Pattinson's Neil are affable Englishmen who serve as the trusty sidekick, and similar scenes, like talking in a bustling city while the camera circles around you. The opening line to Tenet could be a direct nod to Inception, however. As they wait outside the Opera House for the opening siege, the driver in the van says, "Wake up the Americans," in reference to Washington and co. A possible point towards the sleeping devices in Inception, keenly observed by the Independent's Jacob Stolworthy. While this may not have any relevance to the plot or any real link to Inception, it does at least feel like a direct homage to the movie Nolan released 10 years prior. Maybe Nolan will make a similar third film in 2030. Tenet may have similar themes as Inception and Memento, but there is also a similar link to another popular Nolan movie. Okay, let's be honest, I don't think there is an unpopular Nolan movie. The Prestige. In The Prestige, we see Christian Bale's Alfred going up against Hugh Jackman's Robert in a battle for the greatest illusion. But, spoiler warning, we learn that these aren't the only two protagonists. And in fact, Bale's Alfred is actually twins, with the two switching in and out of the narrative intermittently. Until the end of the movie, we are completely unaware that there are two protagonists operating in the same space. Exactly the same as Tenet, with the two crossing over in the car chase scene and in Oslo. When you've been a part of arguably one of the greatest performances of all time, it is hard to insert an Easter egg to that performance in one of your movies. That is seemingly what Nolan did with the subtle link between Branagh's Sator and Heath Ledger's Joker. Nolan quickly paints the picture that Sator is the bad guy, with, to be honest, very little redeeming qualities. One of the biggest moments of depravity from Sator comes at the point where he attacks his wife Kat, who he supposedly loves, and yells at her, "Look at me!" This can be seen as a direct callback to the Joker's hostage video, which was actually directed by the late actor, where the Joker yells at his victim the same line. "Look at me!" If only Kat had said to Sator, "Wanna know how I got these scars?" after getting hit by the inverted bullet. Opportunity missed. Another nod to Nolan's work is the fact that Washington's character isn't given a name. He is simply known as the protagonist, and frankly, we know nothing about him except that he can kick ass, has an awesome beard, and rock a suit like the best of them. To be fair, none of the characters really have much of a backstory or characterization, but you would expect to have some kind of interesting background with your protagonist just to set the stakes, such as Cobb having to make his way back to his family in Inception. Washington's protagonist doesn't have that, instead just following along the course of the plot before eventually driving it. The lack of name is similar to the protagonist in Nolan's first feature film, Following, with the lead character just known as the Young Man. While Tenet isn't a sequel to Inception, could it be a prequel to Interstellar? Not only is time a theme in both movies, with Cooper losing time when he's off-world, there are also further similarities. Firstly, the world in Interstellar is suffering from a climate crisis with the Earth in decay, just like the future Earth in Tenet. There's also the idea of the future generations sending messages and technology back through time to prevent annihilation, both of which are shared by Interstellar and Tenet. While we know that it was Cooper sending messages back in Interstellar, we never learned the identity of the future scientist that Priya refers to as the future Oppenheimer. Could it have perhaps been Murph? Just a thought. Nolan didn't just pay reference to his own work, but also other movies and franchises in the genre, primarily James Bond. Both Bond and Washington's protagonist are suave action heroes who like to play with expensive toys and dress up nice. Nolan even said that after watching, he was awestruck by The Spy Who Loved Me and wanted to get that feeling back on the big screen, hence why we see such a grand globe-trotting movie. The protagonist buttoning up his suit jacket after hand-to-hand combat is definitely a cheeky wink to Bond. I doubt, though, having Washington introduce himself as the protagonist, would quite have the same effect as Bond James Bond. Nolan also admitted that while he was inspired by the feeling of Bond movies, he made sure not to rewatch them so he wasn't directly influenced by them, but instead just the memory of watching them. But it isn't just the protagonist who can be compared to a Bond character, with other characters serving as Bond character archetypes. Clemence Posey's Laura plays a sort of Q-like figure, giving the protagonist a lowdown on the weapons and guiding him through the technology. Michael Caine's Sir Michael Crosby acts as the M figure, giving the protagonist the keys to the mission and a credit card to spend on whatever he feels like. Even Neil feels more reminiscent of Roger Moore's more flamboyant Bond, as if there are even two Bonds working in the same movie together. Now that would be quite the movie. It wouldn't be a Nolan movie without some type of throwback to one of the greatest directors of all time, Stanley the Manly Kubrick. I may have just committed blasphemy by calling him the Manly there. The comparisons between Interstellar and 2001 are impossible to ignore, and it can be argued that Tenet and Kubrick's jet black satire Dr. Strangelove also share some similarities. Both are set on the backdrop of a World War III paranoia, with a madman triggering off a dead man's switch that, if attacked, would cause doomsday, while the Americans do everything in their power to stop it. The similarities may not go any further than that, but the thought of Aaron Taylor Johnson's Ives riding a bomb and yelling "Yeehaw" would have made for quite the ending. One of the rumors doing the rounds right now is that Neil is actually the son of Kat and Sator, Max. While the protagonist said that he wouldn't go to Kat as it would be dangerous, Neil seemed somewhat dubious of this. In fact, the protagonist almost immediately breaks this by killing Priya just feet away from Kat and Max. The final shot suggests that maybe the protagonist goes off and has a future with Kat and serves as a pseudo-father for Max. Neil did allude that the two of them had a long and storied history, and maybe that's how the protagonist recruited and trained Neil, and the reason why Neil knows so much about him. There is never any proof that Neil is in fact his real name, and he could have changed it so the protagonist did not know his true identity. But it does feel like it might be a little far-fetched, seeing as Neil would have inverted himself for years. Another theory doing the rounds is that Ives is actually Kat's son. Ives is somewhat just dropped into the story halfway through and has a remarkable amount of knowledge about Tenet and the inversion therapy. Could it be that he was Max and that Ives is just a nickname? It could explain why he's so devoted to keeping the algorithm a secret, as he knows the effects it can have on those around him. While a fun theory, like the Neil theory, there is nothing major to support this, but it is fun though, right? One of the most impressive set pieces is the Oslo scene, where the Tenet crew crash a Boeing 747 into Freeport. What makes it more impressive is knowing that it was 100% real. Ever a fan of practical effects and a thrifty fellow, Nolan decided that it would be cheaper and more realistic to actually buy the plane and physically crash it as opposed to visual effects. Let's face it though, it is also a lot cooler than using miniatures. But it wasn't just the plane scene that was a practical effect. In fact, Nolan decided not to use any green screen at all and even used less VFX than your average rom-com. Nolan even decided that the actors should do a majority of their own stunts, with Robert Pattinson having to do a lot of the driving during the Estonia heist sequence. Seeing as he'll be driving the Batmobile very soon, he needs the practice. One of the biggest aspects about Tenet and all of Nolan's films is the massive score. Often escaping the background and wiping out the very thoughts in your head, the music has a daunting and in-your-face presence throughout. Usual collaborator, composer Hans Zimmer, had to drop out of this movie due to scheduling conflicts, with the reins instead passing to Black Panther's Ludwig Göransson. But ever the thorn in Nolan's back, just as Göransson went to record the score, the devastating blow of COVID-19 came down hard and prevented the orchestra from recording together. Instead, Göransson had to record each and every member from their home and compile them together in his studio. Still though, Göransson managed to provide a scene-stealing score, with the use of dissonance keeping you on the edge of your seat from the word go. Nolan may collaborate with many different British actors, but very rarely do they ever use their own accent. In Tenet, Northern Irish actor Kenneth Branagh has a very over-the-top Russian accent, while fellow Brit Himesh Patel has an American accent, I think. Even the British actors playing a Brit don't keep their own accents, with Pattinson opting to drop his own London accent for an imitation of journalist Christopher Hitchens' accent. Not only did the cast have to put on different accents, but they even had to learn to speak backwards for the inverted scene, which is not an easy task. It was even harder for Branagh, who not only had to speak backwards, but had to speak backwards in a Russian accent. So every time you hear someone speaking backwards, that isn't the audio flipped, but actually the actors speaking in reverse. Or, as I like to say, giving back talk. Last but not least, just like directors Alfred Hitchcock and Quentin Tarantino, Nolan decided to make a cameo in this movie, although you would have been very unlikely to notice. That's because it's only his breath that makes a cameo. Göransson decided to incorporate Nolan's breathing into the score around Seder, by having the director breathe heavily into the mic while Göransson manipulated the sound to work in the score. Nolan probably could have done with one of those oxygen masks after recording. To be fair, I think I could do with one after talking for so long. So what was your craziest hidden detail or Easter egg? Did you catch them all?